join me in a very warm welcome home to campus to Dr. Marianne Cooper.
Hello, everybody. So thank you for having me here. I'm delighted to be here. I'm also grateful to be here today. I owe a lot to this institution. And I would not be the person or the scholar that I am were it not for the education that I received here at UCSD. And it's because here is where I learned how to turn my passion into action. So I've been thinking a lot about my journey here. I arrived in the fall of 1991. I was a student at Eleanor Roosevelt College. And as many of you may know, as a part of being at that college, you take a 2-year class that's called The Making of the Modern World. What an ambitious title for a course, right? And it's 2 years, but that's exactly what it was. It starts out with anthropology, ancient civilizations, and you go through the whole course of human history. It is a blend of politics and sociology and economics and religion and so many things. But the biggest gift of what I learned here is how to think about complex things and how to communicate about complex things. And it turns out that that's the exact skill set that I needed to turn my passion in advancing women and addressing inequality, to turn all of that into action. So as a sociologist, I've been drawn to what's called public sociology. Public sociology is engaging with non-academic audiences about significant issues that have policy dimensions or political dimensions. And a lot of sociology, a lot of the knowledge that we have as academics and scholars about social problems and social dynamics remains in the ivory tower. Very little of it gets shared. Very little knowledge that's there in an academic journal article gets shared with the wider public, and it is such an enormous loss. And very early on in my career, I decided I did not want to spend my life writing articles that 20 other sociologists read. So fortunately, it was here at UCSD where I learned that skill set to be a public sociologist. So I learned how to think about complex things. And I learned that the first step in doing that is that you have to understand why. Not just that something is happening, not just that a social phenomenon exists, but why. And there's usually a complex set of factors. But that's just the beginning. Then you need to be able to distill its most important elements. You need to be able to synthesize that together. And then you need to clearly communicate it in an accessible way and in a powerful way that moves people to action. And that is how sociology can actually change the world. So I focus on gender inequality and economic inequality, but the way I think of myself as a public sociologist. And so that's actually what I'm going to do here today. We're going to talk about a complex topic. We're going to talk about why there are so few women in leadership. And in true public sociology form, I'm going to not just talk about it, but I'm going to leave you with a set of things that you can do to create a more equal world. So my goal today is to share knowledge and to inspire you to make a difference. And I want to inspire you because we have a very large social problem on our hands. As Cheryl has said many times, the blunt truth is that men still run the world, and I don't think it's going all that well. And we could have another day-long conversation about that. But the good news is that we have made a lot of progress. The gender wage gap has narrowed considerably over the last few decades, although we're kind of stalled there. Women are outpacing men when it comes to higher education. Women now are earning 57% of all bachelor's degrees, 60% of all master's degrees. But when you look up at the highest levels of power, where decisions are made that impact all of our lives, women remain in the minority. And here are just a few statistics that get at this. Of the 195 independent countries in the world, right now only 14 are led by women. Women hold only about a quarter of parliamentary seats globally. In the United States, we had a great election last time around for women candidates, but women still make up only 24% of Congress. And it is 2020, and women started outpacing men in terms of bachelor's degrees in the early 1980s. At UCSD, we're doing really well when it comes to deans and in the administration. We're doing less well when it comes to tenured faculty. Like so many universities and colleges across this country, women, if I'm reading the right statistic, make up only 21% of our tenured faculty here at UCSD. And when you look at these statistics, there's actually a distinct pattern to them, which is that progress has stalled. So from the mid-1960s to the mid-1990s, there was a sort of upward trend. Women flooded into higher education, they flooded into the workforce, they moved into middle management. But then things really started to peter out there. And I would say on many levels, we're just moving at a glacial pace. Right now, we have one of the highest numbers of women CEOs of S&P 500 companies. I looked last night, we have 29, which means that less than 6% of those CEOs are women. So upward trends have plateaued, and by some indicators, we're actually going backwards. So if you look at the number of women majoring in computer science, in the mid-1980s, actually women made up about a third of students who are majoring in computer science, and now that's gone down to about 18%. Sociologists refer to this phenomenon, the sort of slowing in women's progress, as the stalled revolution. And the question is why? Why has there been this stall in women's progress? Why is the amount of women coming out of college, there's just so many skilled, educated women, but by the time you get to the highest levels, the candidates are overwhelmingly men. So what's happening between those 2 points? And most of my day-to-day job is actually focused on this question. The lab where I work, where we look at gender bias and how stereotypes are impacting all of these things. But this is how I got into the whole lean-in story. And this is a while ago now, but Cheryl was sort of living this out in her own life, where more and more of the time she was the only woman in the room. And she wanted to dig into the research on this issue. So many years ago, I received an email from our faculty director, and the subject heading of the email was an opportunity. And the email explained that Cheryl was looking to hire someone who's an expert on all of this, to keep her up to date on research and to translate that research into everyday language. And so I just laid out that I've always had this desire to be a public sociologist. So this is basically an email saying, would you like to be a public sociologist and work with Sheryl Sandberg? So given my background, this was like the ideal opportunity. And I also should say, like, this never happens to people like me. Like, you never get emails like this. So I replied to Cheryl, we had this meeting, and the first meeting was just to kind of talk about what in the complexity of this question, what are all the factors at work here? Why has there been this lack of progress for women? So we talked about gender bias, racial bias, men not doing their fair share at home, the lack of robust maternity and paternity leave policies. These are things that people might refer to as external barriers. Sociologists call these structural barriers. And then we talked about another set of things, like lowered expectations for success, fear of failure. These are things that people might describe as internal barriers. Sociologists and psychologists refer to it as internalized oppression, or a way of thinking that you see in groups, in people who are members of lower status groups. So today I'm going to talk about these barriers and at least a few of them, and what we can do to overcome them. One that's talked about in the book Lean In is this notion of a leadership ambition gap. And when you look at the data, the surveys, one after another do show that when it comes to aspirations to top jobs, it tends to be the case that more men than women want those top jobs. So in the Women in the Workplace reports that I work on, which is a partnership between Lean In and McKinsey, in 2018, we found that when asked, do you want to be a top executive, 45% of the men respondents said they wanted to be a top executive, but only 33% of the women did. When jobs are described as challenging, powerful, involving high levels of risk and responsibility, they tend to be more appealing to men than to women. And when Lean In first came out, I went to a lot of talks that Cheryl gave, and I'm never going to forget this because I think it just brings to life sort of an origin of the problem. At the beginning of the talk, she would say to the group, stand up if you've ever said out loud to somebody else that you want to be CEO of your company, President of the United States, #1 in your class. And very, very, very few women stood up. Well, she did this multiple times. And it's this poignant moment where you're like, that's kind of weird, right? Why aren't more women standing up and saying, yes, this is what I want to do? I'm going to get into the reasons why we see that. But from the outset, I want to be very, very clear that like other achievement gaps, the lack of women at the top is a socially produced phenomenon. It's not that there's something wrong with women. It's that we as a society have created the context in which women come to feel that they can't stand up. So 3 reasons we're going to get into today. I only have like 20 more minutes with you all, so I think you can handle a quick pace here. You are UCSD people after all. But the first one is that a lot of women either feel or are actually made to feel like they might not quite have the right skills or abilities to do it. The second reason is because it is still very distasteful in our society for women to be openly ambitious. When someone says, gosh, she's really ambitious, it's typically not a compliment. And the third reason we'll get into is that many women along the way come to think that it's almost impossible to both have a successful career and be the kind of parent that they want to be. So I'm going to get into all 3 of those. The first one, we can broadly define it as self-confidence, or perhaps a lack of self-confidence. That's the way it's talked about, as a lack of self-confidence in women. You see it like in magazine stands, and it's a perennial topic of conversation. Within the fields of sociology and psychology, a part of that topic is called attribution theory, which is a fancy way of saying when you are successful, to what do you attribute your success? And what research shows is that men expect to perform better on a test than they actually do, and women expect to perform worse on a test than they actually do. So you could kind of distill that down to men overestimate their abilities and women tend to underestimate their abilities. And you'll see this pop up in different places, and that's when you really know it's a social phenomenon. So there's a bunch of studies that have this similar finding, but I'll just give you one statistic. There was a survey done of several thousand potential political candidates, all with the credentials to run for office. And the men were 60% more likely than the women to think they were very qualified to run. So what you will see often in these studies is men and women with comparable levels or skills or however they do on a test, but different perceptions of what that means. And what's more is that when men perform well, they will attribute their success to their abilities, right? They'll be like, I'm awesome. You know, when women perform well, they tend to point to external factors to explain their success. So they'll say that they worked hard, which is really important, as we know, but they'll often point to their team or to their mentors, and even to a lucky break. And what's interesting here is that it's not just women who will attribute their success to external factors. Other people will readily do it for us. So I was in the middle of kind of going through all this research, and this was a while ago now, but Facebook filed to go public. And the New York Times wrote this about Cheryl. Everyone agrees she is wickedly smart, but she has been lucky and has had powerful mentors along the way. So that's a way of taking away her success, right? So self-confidence, or the belief that you have what it takes to succeed, has a huge influence, obviously, over the choices we all make in our lives and our careers. But what studies point to is that women will have lower expectations for success, especially in traditional male domains, so like science, technology, engineering, math. So in this kind of larger debate about the lack of self-confidence in women, it's sort of like women should just have self-confidence. That's what you'll see if you are reading it in a magazine. But the real thing we should be asking ourselves is, why would we see this social pattern in the first place? Where is it coming from? Right? And really, it can be traced to the fact that these are expressions at the individual and personal level of larger societal beliefs. So what studies show is that all of us, when we're running these studies and the experiments, we all as a culture tend to believe that men are slightly more competent than women at a lot of things, but again, especially so in these traditional male areas of STEM and also leadership. And this belief influences our assessments, both of our own skills and abilities and of other people's skills and abilities. So a study exemplifying this was the premise was they sent out CVs for a lab manager position to science faculty across the country. And you think science faculty, it's hard to get a more objective group of people, right? They think, a lot of people laughed there, that's funny, it is. Okay, but we should think that they're very objective, right? They're scientists after all. And so it was the exact same resume, identical, but some of them had a man's name on it and some of them had a woman's name on it. And when the authors of the study got the results back, what they found is that science faculty, both men and women science faculty, gave the male candidate higher marks, right? Higher starting salary, more mentoring, and a higher likelihood of saying they would hire him. So in other words, at the same level of performance, men are seen to be doing better than women. So women are actually held to higher standards. They have to prove themselves more and provide more evidence of their competence to be seen as equally competent as a man. Another study gets at this in a different way. It's quite a creative study. It was a study of mothers of 11-month-old babies, and they were asked to estimate their baby's crawling ability. And there was this sloping walkway. And they were asked, like, how steep of a slope would your baby climb? How successful would your baby be? And it's important to know that at 11 months old, there's no motor skill differences between boy and girl babies. But what the analysis showed is that the mothers sort of expected a difference. So compared to how the babies actually performed in this crawling test, the mothers of sons overestimated their sons' crawling ability, and the mothers of daughters underestimated their daughters' crawling ability. And this reflects widespread gender stereotypes, right? That boys are more physically competent and fearless and risk-taking, and girls are less of all of those things. And I think this study is very powerful because if I had $1 for every person who's come up to me to say, I raised my son and daughter exactly the same and they're totally different, I would be paying for drinks tonight with my friends. These gender stereotypes are so pervasive and they're so widely shared by all of us, they filter into these micro interactions that we have with our children, in which you could think, like, why would you exhibit gender bias towards your own children? But that's just to illuminate how deep-seated these things are. So we sort of internalize these negative messages that are kind of everywhere or nowhere at the same time that circulate about women, that they're not good at math, that they are not leaders, that they are not as good as men. And this gets reflected back in terms of how we think and feel about ourselves. So power and inequality don't just work around us, they actually work through us, raising the expectations of the more powerful and lowering the expectations of the less powerful. So how does all of this play out in real life? The panelists were talking about this. If there's a job description, men might meet like 60% of the requirements and apply, and women will be like, I need to meet all of the requirements to apply. And we can sit there and we can say, come on, girls, come on, young women, just throw your hat in the ring. But what's happening there, and I want to be very clear, is that women are holding themselves to higher standards because we as a society hold them to higher standards. This is not an irrational response. It is actually completely rational, and this is why it's happening. So what do we do about this? Because it's actually very hard to change the way you feel, right? So even if we can't change the way we feel, we can change how we respond by making an adjustment. And what I want you to take away from this is that you can realize that there are a lot of social forces that are coming together to create these conditions in which maybe you feel a little bit less confident or you're kind of hesitant to jump into something. But what I really want to point out to you is that critical voice in your head, that is gender inequality. Often combined with other forms of inequality, racial inequality, class inequality, first generation to college. I don't belong here. I'm not good enough. I'm not smart enough. So I don't know about you, but when I kind of connected all of those dots, that made me really angry. So one thing we can do to address all of this is to do our best to turn off that critical voice in our head and really understand that it's like the microphone or the microphone of inequality or the way it gets amplified around us. So turn that voice off and take a risk or claim that seat at the table or tell someone they're being too aggressive. That's one thing that we can do. Okay, so the second reason for the leadership gap, which we also had heard the panelists talk about, is that it is still distasteful in our society for women to be powerful and hard-charging. We are deeply uncomfortable with powerful women. And this was like one of the first research projects I did for Cheryl was about this ambition gap. And we met to talk about my findings, and I was like, well, you know, girls are kind of discouraged from leading and boys are encouraged to lead. And she's like, well, give me an example. And I was like, well, when girls engage in leadership behaviors, they're often called bossy, right? We never use the word bossy to describe boys. And she was like, I've always been called bossy. And I'm like, I bet you were. And we are surrounded by these kinds of stereotypes. I know in Lean In, we mentioned a national retail chain that had T-shirts, and for the boys it said "smart like daddy," and for the girl it said "pretty like mommy." A year ago, Clark's Shoes had a shoe that was they had a boys' version, a girls' version. It was actually a very similar version, but the girls' shoe was named Dolly Babe, and the boys' was named Leader. Many of you may have heard of this at this point, but there's a really interesting case study that brings a lot of this to life. It was written as a Harvard Business School case study on Heidi Roizen, who's a very successful venture capitalist. And the case study described how she kind of basically amassed her power, right? She used her strategic connections, created these relationships, and then how she was quite successful in the end. And a professor at HBS had half of his students read the case study with Heidi Roizen. And then he had the other half of his classes read the case study where he changed the name to Howard. Just let's see, for fun. That's like how professors are. So what was interesting is that the students found both Heidi and Howard as competent. They were similarly competent, which is actually very good news. But Howard was like someone they would like, and someone they want to hang out with, someone they'd hire, someone they wanted to be around. But Heidi was out for herself, and she was selfish. She was not someone they'd want to hire or work with. So to get under what's happening there, because it's the same case study, just different names, women are expected to be nice and friendly and warm and nurturing. That is our belief about what women are like and how they should behave. Men are expected to be forceful and competitive, opinionated, decisive. Those are our expectations about what men are like and how men should behave. The problem for women is that our conceptions of leadership actually overlap very well with our conception about what men are like. There's a match there. This is actually around the world we find this phenomenon. But for women, there's a mismatch. Our understanding of leadership is very different from our understanding about what women are like. So when a woman is hard-charging, when she's forceful, when she pushes her team to perform, when she's competitive, she is violating social expectations about how she should behave, and we all don't like it. All of us. And the way that this manifests is often like this. She's very good at her job, she's just difficult. She always delivers, she's just not a team player. What this is the success likability penalty. That's what sociologists and psychologists call it. The problem this creates for women, and we also talked about this on the panel, is a double bind. If you're really authoritative and you kind of have a commanding presence, people think you're competent, but they don't like you. If you're really friendly and really approachable, people really like you, but they don't think that you're very competent. So you're damned if you do, doomed if you don't kind of thing. It's intractable. It's extremely difficult. And it often happens in different ways throughout women's careers. Sometimes early on, women can be told, like, you don't have enough gravitas, you know? And then once they get to a senior role where by being a woman in a senior role, you're kind of upending the gender hierarchy, all of a sudden people don't like you and you're scary. And it's very hard individually for women to navigate this. It's very disorienting. It's like, what's going on? So what do we do about the success likability penalty? The first thing we can do is that we can flip the interpretation, and we should really stop calling little girls bossy. It's a small thing, but I think it matters. Cheryl was telling me that she had a friend who was watching her twins play, a girl and boy, and she was just about to say that the little girl was being bossy, and she was inspired by Lean In, and then she said, "You have executive leadership skills." Which I like. I like that story. The second thing we need to do is to teach organizations about this. For those of you who are managers, part of performance reviews, if you play a senior role in an organization or a company, you have a lot of influence to make an impact here. And when you're in a room or a meeting where you hear this kind of, she's really good at her job, but, is when you can intervene. The best thing to do for an organization is to create really clear criteria in advance of the hiring process or in advance of the performance review so everyone sticks to those criteria. Because what happens to women and people of color is that additional criteria are lobbed in that become disqualifying. As an example, a colleague of mine was on a faculty search committee, and they'd gone through a few men candidates' applications, and they got to the first woman's, and somebody said, well, her teaching evaluations aren't really good. And my colleague was like, okay, well then we need to look at all the other teaching evaluations of the 3 prior candidates, right? So what she did is she was a criteria monitor. She was like, what are the criteria we're looking at? And then if we're going to hold to those, let's make sure every single candidate is held to those criteria. All too often, women's personalities become a criteria. So you can say, so I didn't know communication style was a really important criteria. Are you saying that it is? And if someone says yes, then you can be like, okay, so let's look at all of these candidates about their communication style. Because there's a lot of men who are getting to positions of power who are jerks. Right? All right, the third area I'm going to talk about today is about, in terms of why more women don't stand up, is that women really come to feel like they can't be super successful and be the parent they want to be. And so one of the reasons that women come to feel this way is that we as a society continue to believe in very large numbers that mothers are the best caretakers of their children. It is an enduring belief. And Pew Research does these surveys pretty regularly, and I just pulled the most recent one last night. So when they ask people about the ideal situation for young children, people will say like 76% of people will say it's ideal for the dad to be working full time, while just 33% of people think this is the ideal situation for the mother. And in fact, 21% of people think that mothers working not at all is what's most ideal for children. And so despite this really strong cultural belief that mothers are the best caretakers of their children, and of course many mothers are, there's a lot of research on the effects of maternal employment on children's outcomes. There was a big study done in the UK recently. It was 11,000 families and found no negative impact of mothers working. And in fact, the study found that the highest levels of well-being for girls was when both parents were at home, but both parents worked. A recent study of 50,000 adults in 25 countries found that when mothers worked, girls ended up getting more education, earned more money, and were more likely to hold supervisory roles. So when we look at outcomes, what research finds is that it's not who is providing the care that matters, it's the quality of the care, which makes sense. No matter if the quality of the care or the care is a daycare center, a nanny, a grandparent, it's the quality of the care that we need to care about. But this belief coincides, this belief that mothers are the best caretakers, with the rise of intensive mothering, which the panelists also spoke to. So there has been this kind of cultural belief that's intensified over time, that again, mothers are the best caretakers of their children and should be always available for their children. And you see this change in time diary studies that Lisa mentioned. So in the 1970s, stay-at-home mothers spent as much time on primary childcare activities as working mothers did in the year 2000. So another way of saying that is my mother spent the same amount of time with me as a stay-at-home mother in the 1970s as I spent on primary child care activities with my children today. That's crazy, right? So what's happening? There's this cultural elevation of women spending time with their children. And this intense standard can leave so many women feeling like they're coming up short. The way the numbers add up is that working mothers today get less leisure than stay-at-home mothers in the 1970s did, and less sleep, which you can probably tell from looking at me. There's also this point that Lisa raised too, that our standards mean that we're kind of micromanaging our kids' lives more. It used to be the case that, I would play with other kids in the neighborhood. I did my own homework. My mom didn't do it with me. There's a great meme online about the 70s mother who would lock her kids outside in the summer and just drink Tab all day. Really inspired by that. So working mothers are feeling this intense pressure when they're measuring themselves about these really crazy standards of what the best mother is. And then they face an additional issue, which is that women are doing more at home. They do 40, when you're looking at a family, a married couple, where both parents work, women are doing 40% more childcare and 30% more housework than are their husbands, even today. So what do we do about this? I would tell you all, if you are in this phase of life, to put your feelings in a historical context. And I would tell you to not feel guilty, but I know that's probably not going to happen. So feel less guilty is the way I look at it. There are a lot of benefits to working, as all of you know. Greater financial security, lower rates of depression. There are also benefits to your children, which I mentioned with girls. With boys, boys whose mothers work end up doing more housework as adults. So what can organizations do about all of this? The sad truth is that women often either leave their position or don't go for the next opportunity because they're tired of trying to fight for tiny amounts of flexibility that would enable them to be the employees and mothers they want to be. And the truth of the matter is this work and family stuff is not just an issue for women, it's an issue for men. You can see it in the surveys for working fathers. Almost half feel like they don't have balance. Almost half worry about they're not spending enough time with their children. We've got a looming crisis coming with the aging boomers. We're totally not scaled or scoped to deal with that. So I think organizations at the forefront of this are starting to think about work in a fundamentally different way, that work is a verb and not a place, and that people should be able to work where and when works best for them, assuming they're getting their job done and looking at results and performance, not FaceTime. That is the direction that we're headed in progressive and I think innovative companies. So I want to end by highlighting something that I started with. At the beginning of this talk, I said the lack of women at the top is a socially produced phenomenon. It's not that something's wrong with women, but that we as a society have created the context in which women come to feel that they can't stand up. And I've also talked about a few things that you all can do to change things, to think differently, to help other people, to intervene in moments of inequality. So I want each of you to think about the one or two things that you can do, because doing one or two things differently actually isn't that hard. But the way I look at it is one or two things combined with one or two things combined with one or two things, when you get to the aggregate level, is what leads to social change. And massive social change is exactly what we need. Thank you.